And over time, I've begun to realise that Leighton House is either people's favourite place or somewhere they've never heard of. There's no middle ground. So what I'm going to do, as others have done, is really rehearse how Leighton House got to the point that it is now and what lies behind the ambition of an £8 million project that's about to start. Just get that to... So the thing about Leighton House is entirely caught up with the life of Frederick Leighton. Here are these 4 portraits of him as a precocious young artist through his prime in a portrait by George Frederick Watts, his neighbour and friend, and then his pomp as the president of the Royal Academy from 1878, there wearing his chain of office, and before his death he would be ennobled as the only British artist to have received that honour. And at the time of his death, virtually all his obituaries referred to the fact of his house being part of his legacy, being part of what his achievements of an artist should be. And that house grew really in parallel, in tandem with the development of his career. So as you can see on the left, it was relatively modest in its first version, but was more or less for the 30 years that he was living there a constant project of extension and elaboration and embellishment. So it ended up again being referred to as this private palace of art. It was much written about, much photographed. I don't know why it's quite jumping forward like that. So this was his studio. He liked nothing more than journalists coming to visit him and using the house as a means of projecting a sense of his success, and so that it came to, in a way, embody the idea of how the great artist should live. And that interest absolutely accelerated with the construction of this extraordinary Arab Hall, as it was called, onto the side of the house, about a decade after the house had been completed. So this is the end of the 1870s, and the amount of interest in the house certainly accelerates from that point onwards. One of the great oddities of it is it only has one single, very modest bedroom, and this is it. So whatever his interests were, sort of entertaining guests overnight was not one of them. But it makes a remarkable insight into the sense in which the rest of the house is conceived to be exposed, to be seen, to entertain in, to be published, and this was really the only private space within it, tucked round a little corner so that you wouldn't really even be aware there was anything as mundane as a bedroom within this house he had created. And it was in this bed that he died in 1896, and that raised the immediate question of what was to happen to the house. Just to give an indication of the success that he enjoyed at this point, this is his funeral in St. Paul's Cathedral on the left-hand side here, with, as you can see, the streets lined with the public. He was a member, the commanding officer for a very long period of the time, of the Artist Rifles Volunteer Corps. This was set up in 1859. Most unexpected people, including Morris and Rossetti, were members, not for very long, I don't think. They had a great argument about what colour uniform they should wear. But Leighton, who was good at everything, became the commanding officer. So this is the guard of honour as his coffin is carried in, and then he was interred in the crypt right next to Sir Christopher Wren. So all of this just sort of emphasising the status that he enjoyed. So the problem then was what to do with the... Sorry, I don't know why it keeps jumping forward. To do with the house. So it was left to his 2 sisters in its entirety. Their initial impulse was to try and sell it and keep it together, because the relationship between the house, its decoration and its content was very sophisticated. It wasn't a question of him just building it and then putting stuff in it. Each room definitely had a theme that culminated in his own workspace upstairs in the studio. So they couldn't find any taker. They then put the house up for auction. It didn't sell. And the poor auctioneer wrote a little comment that basically said, "Don't blame me, it's only got 1 bedroom. How do you expect me to sell a house like that?" So the only option then left to them was to sell the contents. So over an 8-day sale at Christie's, virtually the entire collections were sold. So they was then left with a house that they couldn't sell, now devoid of its contents, at which point a neighbour called Emily Barrington approached the sisters and said she, with others, would take it on and run it as a centre for the arts. So here is the studio as it then was, virtually devoid of any content, but hung with about the best part of 1,000 drawings by Leighton that they had reacquired after a sort of odd circuitous route. The sisters sold them then sold everything else, and on the proceeds of selling everything else, bought back the drawings they'd just sold. So that's what was essentially the collection at that point. That carried on until the end of the 1920s, when Mrs. Barrington sold it or gave the house to the council, and then this is the bomb damage suffered, the first of two, first in 1940 and then in 1944, which, as you can see, destroyed the front steps and approach to the house and blew out all the windows. And as a low post-war priority, it wasn't restored again until the mid-1950s, and when it was restored, it was only done so to make it functional, to make it usable again. So there are these very bleak images of all of it sort of whitewashed, the original light fittings replaced by fluorescent tubes hanging from the ceilings, the original coloured floors stripped back. So as much as could be done to sort of eliminate its Victorian character was carried out at that point. Then gradually, from the 1980s, the long process of coming back to try and reinstate the house at something closer to how it had been when Leighton left it began. Of course, a very challenging thing to try and do because the contents had been entirely dispersed. But the great saving grace was it was so written about and so well illustrated that there was an enormous amount of information on which to base that restoration. And then between 2008 and 2010, there was a very major restoration of the house, and that was driven by the need to rewire it and place all the alarm systems and heating systems, but it then turned into a representation of the entire house, very much based on the descriptions of how it had appeared in Leighton's day. And so again, this is probably going to jump. No, it's not. So here's a set again of images as it now appears. But this project was always going to be followed by a final piece of work, because while this addressed a presentation of the historic interiors, what it didn't do was address the failings of the back of house, if you like. And since the restoration has been completed, we've done a series of exhibitions that took over the whole house. So our permanent collection was taken down and the house was converted into what was an incredibly effective way of showing, and this was the exhibition of the work of Lawrence Alma Tadema, a major exhibition we had in 2017, which drew huge numbers of people. I'd like to say it always looks like this. That would be a complete fib. So, but this only went to serve to emphasise the very lack of facilities needed. So these will be all familiar to you. The front of house difficulties, the fact it only had a single female and a single male loo, nowhere to deal with school children and visiting groups. The storage of the collection was extremely poor. The wonderful drawings by Leighton stored in what was supposed to be a temporary office, which had become a permanent office. The Met's lacrimae being hoisted into the building for exhibition, and the store conditions, as you can see, pretty terrible. It's a wonderful venue for entertaining, for having dinners in, but I'm always very grateful the guests never get to see where their food is coming from, which might put them off. So again, this sort of back of house arrangement putting the original fabric of the building at risk. And then the condition of bits of the building at the east end, which wasn't covered in the previous restoration, also demanded attention. So those are sort of reasons behind why we wanted to do something, but there was a bigger reason in museum terms, and that is to acknowledge the fact that Leighton House here is in fact part of this extraordinary colony of purpose-built studio houses, all of which date from the last quarter of the 19th century, and absolutely, I'm sure that visitors come and go from Leighton House at the moment with no sense of the fact that this remarkable group of houses surrounds the building, because there is nowhere to tell that story. There's no space or opportunity to embrace the neighbours that surround us. So the story of this was that Leighton House and Val Princep's house, the artist who lived next door, were built first in the mid-1860s, and then in 1875, Little Holland House, which had stood here and which in fact was the trigger for why these artists gravitated to this particular part of London, was demolished in order to make way for Melbury Road. And then, as you can see, the majority of the plots along Melbury Road were bought by a second wave of artists who then really followed the lead of Prinsep and Leighton and commissioned progressive architects. So Philip Webb, the architect of the Red House, as you were hearing this morning, was responsible for Prinsep's house. Richard Norman Shaw, responsible for two others, and Frederick Peach Cockerell, responsible for G.F. Watts's house. So in terms of losses, Colin Hunter's house, he was as you might anticipate, a seascape painter in the middle of Kensington. His house was bombed in the Second World War, and the great tragedy is Watts's house was the only one of this group to be willfully demolished in 1961 to make way for a very ugly block of flats. There was a public hearing about whether or not it should be demolished, which concluded that the house as a purpose-built studio house was of interest. It had five studios within it. The problem was in 1961 it belonged to this artist called G.F. Watts, and it basically says, were it a worthwhile artist, there might be an argument for keeping it. So it's demolished on those grounds. So I'll leave Cicely tomorrow to tell you more about that. So this is this wonderful group, and there's fantastic imagery and information about these artists because, as Leighton was, they were very happy to open them, to show those studios, to have those studios written up, all with this sense of keeping them in the public eye. And so there's a huge amount of information that can be presented to tell the story of why it was that these artists came to this particular part of London, and it so conflicts with the kind of idea that visitors have of the artist in their kind of garret struggling to make ends meet, where they're really confronted by these palaces built on a very grand scale. This is a period view going up Melbury Road. This is Colin Hunter's house that has gone, and then two houses on the corner there. I particularly want to draw your attention to. The one at the top is the most remarkable of all of them, the house built by the architect William Burgess for his own use, although he died really not much later. And that has been owned and lived in by Jimmy Page, who I'm sure needs no introduction. I saw the record shop down the road as well stocked if you need to. So the guitarist from Led Zeppelin has lived there since 1973 and has been a remarkable custodian of it. He has a great interest in this period. He lent things to the recent Burne-Jones exhibition at Tate. So all would be well, except the upstart Robbie Williams, whose fame, I don't know if it spread to the assembled company. He was in a boy band called Take That, and I think is just about to or has just taken up a residency in Las Vegas. So book your tickets now. So he bought the house next door, which had been the home of the artist Luke Fildes, and then, threatening to knock Brexit off the front page of the newspapers, there's been this extraordinary battle between the two of them as Robbie Williams has tried to build a swimming pool under the garden of his house, threatening the foundations of the Tower House. And so Jimmy Page has been trying to prevent this from happening, and it has been covered in every newspaper and on the national news. The result of it is it seems he's going to be allowed to build his basement, but more or less has to excavate it with a sort of hand trowel. The great irony of all of this is Richard Norman Shaw, the architect of the Fildes house, when it was being built simultaneously with Burgess's next door, wrote a letter to Fildes saying it was extraordinary the scale of the foundations that Burgess was putting in place for his little castle. You know, he's building these enormous foundations, which of course have turned out to be a very sensible thing to do in the light of the advent of the swimming pool. But what this has served to do very timely from our point of view is to bring this whole story to the fore and to raise awareness of the significance of this group of houses in a way that would have been completely unpredictable. So what we're just about to do is all about not the original house, but the additions that were made to it in the 20th century. So at its east end, this was its first version. Leighton then built this additional sliver on to expand his studio. Then he built the Arab Hall. Then he built his winter studio to counter the difficulties of painting through the winter when the quality of light was so poor in smog-bound London. Then there was the silk room added, and that's how he left it. There were then two additions made. A local family built the Perrin Gallery, it was called. Their daughter had died of the Spanish flu epidemic in 1919, and so this was a memorial to her. She was an artist. And then in the mid-50s, the space beneath Leighton's winter studio was bricked in by the borough engineer. And that tells you all you need to know about the quality of that piece of architecture. So to relate that to the building, this is the 20s edition, and then on the garden side, this is the sort of bunker infill beneath the winter studio. So what we're doing is to try and exploit the maximum benefit out of these additional pieces, so that all the pressure that currently exists on the historic house gets transferred into this bit. A new entrance is formed here. All the things like shop, cloakroom, cafe will be housed within there. It all gets levelled from being about 3 or 4 different changes of level to being on a single level from front to back. And as you can see, maximum advantage is taken of all of this. So a new basement is being excavated, which is brilliant. We thought this was going to be a very controversial thing because the house is owned by the Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, who have pioneered a policy in London of preventing basements being put under listed buildings. So as the borough was going to have to give itself permission to do something it doesn't give us. But the great thing is the Page Robbie Williams battle has taken all the flack, so we've slipped in without anybody noticing. So our basement will contain a new collection store, a new drawings gallery, as well as cloakrooms, a new reception space, a refurbished exhibition gallery, and then a new office placed on the top of all of that. And then from the garden side, this is the 50s bit gone, and a new piece of building at the side to contain a helical staircase and a lift to provide access to all parts of the building. This is the view from that recovered space beneath the winter studio, where you will begin to get these vistas to the surrounding houses of the rest of the Holland Park Circle. And then in the reception is where the interpretation will be introduced. The idea being that Leighton House will stop being this single site, but will embrace the neighbourhood and will encourage everybody to think of it as a gateway into the discovery of those other houses. So that will be through the interpretation within the house itself, and then by encouraging people to then go on a little walking tour around the surrounding houses. I think I've run out of time, but these are just early ideas of how that will be. These are 2 frescoes actually which will be in here, which come from Little Holland House, the house by Watts, the house that started this whole story. This is the bottom of the new staircase. It looks a bit like the sort of curator wagging the architectural dog, in that this is this wonderful sculpture by Leighton which snakes around the figure, and it's as though we commissioned a helical staircase just so we could put this here, but it wasn't that way around at all. But then finally, the project to do this coincided, or was just about to get its final approval, when the terrible fire in the borough of the Grenfell Tower happened, which cast great doubt on the whole project. But curiously, it's now being seen, and the council's priorities have changed, as somewhere, because it combines these east and west elements in a very sort of natural and harmonious way, that it potentially has a new role to play as a place that can bring communities together, something now that the council is much more interested in perhaps than it should have been earlier. And to that end, within the staircase, we're working with an Iranian artist based in Vancouver, in fact, and have commissioned her to make a piece that will sit within the volume of that staircase, and which responds to the Arab Hall at the other end of the building, but signals that that part of the heritage of Leighton House also has something to say about its future. There, thank you very much.